Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to my show. My name is Jason DeCosta, and this is Consistent Preterism. Thank you for joining me today. Hope everybody's doing well out there. I wanted to share a audio just because I was in the mood to do a rant, and I was speaking with a fellow IOer recently, a couple weeks back, and we got to speaking about specific arguments and, the repeated mantra of the anti-IO person. And one of them that came up was from the great baboon himself, Michael Karras. I guess in certain Facebook groups, he likes to, take the voice as sort of like, or take the position as sort of the voice of the one who thinks he conquers IO. And obviously, if you've seen my critiques of his videos, you know that it's a laughing stock. But anyway, Karras has a few core arguments that he clings to. And at the very top of that list, apparently, is a argument that says something to the effect of Paul never actually calls the nations the children of Israel, right? He never refers to them as the 10 northern tribes, or I think that's what it is, specifically the 10 northern tribes. But regardless, he holds firm in this mud pile, if you will, of irrelevant nonsense. And his core argument is that Paul never specifically or actually says that, and IO is just sort of inventing that and inserting that into the texts. When in reality, if you've been around my channel and if you've become familiar with the IO arguments, you know that there are countless, not dozens, not hundreds, probably thousands of biblical proof texts for the IO viewpoint. And crystal clear ones, might I add, not, things like Matthew, 22, where they like to go to the parable, right? They're quoting a parable, first of all, as their proof texts or their hope texts. But, they're going to a parable and trying to say, look, the order of this parable doesn't line up with your view. Therefore, we're back, right? It's nonsense, right? But IO comes to the table with crystal clear, ironclad Dagarooskis, and a whole, a whole case full of them. They're just firing at you from all different angles. So I wanted to just take a moment to address that argument. And mind you, this person was laughing the entire time because, you can understand that the sheer chaotic nature of Karras's arguments, and when you consider what the Fool Preterist has to do to get back in the story, right? They continuously make up things. They're reinventing the wheel. They're trying different theories and seeing what fits. But the reality is, if you're existing on the tail end or the backside of the resurrection and the inheritance of the immortal body, then you are probably not part of that story. I mean, that's, common sense 101. Wouldn't take a toddler to understand it. So anyway, if you're a full preterist and you're thinking that somehow you're part of the game, you have to invent some crazy things, which is why, his following is very small and why, full preterism, I think, is taking it on the chin lately. With their, weak attempts to kind of change the game a little bit to get themselves back in and, make things spiritual that are not spiritual, such as the rapture. And I could go on and on. But yeah, they have some serious problems. So what we're going to do today is we're just going to look at one place, right? We only need one place. Like Dave Portnoy's pizza reviews, one bite, everybody knows the rules. One place, everybody knows the rules, right? That's all we're going to do today is one place. And we're going to show you that Paul very clearly shows that the nations that were receiving God's mercy were, in fact, the children of Israel. They were the lost tribes of the children of Israel. They were Ephraim, okay? And so all we got to do is go to Romans chapter 9, okay? And we're going to go to the end here. And I'm going to also demonstrate how Paul uses the term Jew and Israel interchangeably, apart from the lost tribes of Israel. Okay, so to break that down further, you'll often see Paul speak of, the Jews as Jews, rightly so. I mean, that's what they were in that day, so you'll hear them spoken of as Jews. Now, you'll also hear of Paul speak of that same people as Israel, okay, because, again, Paul, writing in different places, in different letters, in different portions about different things, is using different terminology to refer to the same principles, the same concepts, the same topics. And Jews and Israel in that day were synonymous. They meant the same thing. If you were a Jew in that day, you were an Israelite. That's what The whole point is you were from the nation of Israel, or you were affiliated with them through their, culture, religion, whatever you may be, but you were Israel in that day, right? So in my opinion, and from what I've studied, I see, and I know many scholars also agree with this, that Paul uses, and other authors use, the terms Jew and Israel, sometimes synonymously in the text. Okay? Now, on the flip side of that, Paul also refers to a people called Gentiles, right? Or nations, ethnos, right? And he's working through this dilemma, right? This dilemma of, what's the word I'm looking for? I guess enmity between the two groups, the two parties. He's working through that. Now, whether this happened in real-time space history or not is not the issue here. Okay, we're working through what the story says. Okay, and we know that from the Old Testament, we have a history leading up to the New Testament last days of Israel, the 10 northern tribes, and Judah, the 2 southern tribes, having severe enmity over the law. Okay, and this is precisely what Paul says the problem is in places like Colossians, Ephesians, what have you. He's telling them that the enmity was over the law, but that Christ came to put away that enmity. He came to break it all down, to reunite the two into one, right? The parable of the son, right? He's bringing them back together into one new man. Hebrews 9 calls it the restoration of the new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. But that's another story for Hebrews 9, coming up soon, by the way. So going a bit off track here, but my point is that there's always been this enmity that Paul is speaking of, right? So what makes sense? Do you invent your own enmity between Jews or Israelites, I should say, and nations, over the law? Do you invent that? Do you just pop that in there and try to see if it works and then just run with it? No. You allow what the story says in the beginning, in the foundation, to mold your understanding of what's taking place later. Okay, it's not an illegitimate transfer fallacy, like geeks would say. It is a logical way to do the Bible, right? It's a proper hermeneutic to understand things the way that the Bible would have you understand them, and then apply them the same way throughout. Okay, so I'm not reinventing enmity between a random people group and Israel when I know the enmity was already there between the 2 houses of Israel. Okay, but anyway, so Paul is in Romans 9 talking about this mercy that's coming upon the Gentiles or the nations, right? And he's breaking down this barrier, this middle wall between the 2 parties. Now, my theory is that he's breaking down this middle wall between the northern tribes and the southern tribes. He's breaking down the middle wall between the brothers and brethren of Israel. Some people believe that he's breaking down a middle wall between random Joe Blow pagans and Israelites. Okay, that's cool. But I don't. And so here's Paul in Romans 9, verse 22, saying this. He says, "What if God, wanting to show his wrath and to make his power known, endured with much long suffering the vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, and that he might make known the riches of his glory on the vessels of mercy," here it is, "which he has prepared beforehand for glory." Pay attention now. "Even us whom he called, not of the Jews only, but also of the Gentiles." So in other words, not of Israel, not of present day Israel only, but also of the nations, right? So in other words, it's not just occurring in our Jewish circles, present day Israel, but it's also occurring in the nations, okay? Now check this out. Paul, after he asks this rhetorical question in verse 24, but also of the nations, quotes 3 Old Testament passages that are all about Israelites, specifically the 10 northern tribes. And the book of Hosea is the first one that he uses. Now remember, Michael Karras would have you think that Paul never once refers to the nations as the Israelites. Never, right? Even though you find the terms 12 tribes plastered throughout 10 tribes, 12 tribes, the whole 12 tribes, I should say, plastered throughout the New Testament. You see it over and over and over again. Even though you have clear passages, like James writing to the 12 tribes scattered abroad, you have clear statements. These guys will have you believe that they're not to be understood the way that they flat out say, just like they do with the topic of the rapture. It's spiritual, right? Just believe them. They know. But yet the text says something clearly otherwise. So Paul asks about the mercy falling on the Gentiles, and look what he does. He says in verse 25, he quotes this passage. He's answering his own question for you. This is the mysterious, esoteric, magical, mushroom fairy tale nature of the Bible. Paul is quoting the Old Testament passage in a most magical, mysterious way because the nations were receiving mercy, but he's revealing their identity here in Romans 9. He says, as he says in Hosea, I will call them my people who are not my people, and her beloved who is not my beloved. And it shall come to pass in the place where it was said to them, you are not my people, there they shall be called sons of the living God. Now check out the very next verse. Isaiah also cries out concerning Israel. Okay, now wait a minute. Paul just asked about the mercy falling on the Gentiles. He left that as an open-ended question, and he goes into quoting Old Testament texts to shed light on that specific question about the nations. So then why is he quoting this passage concerning Israel? Verse 27, he says, Isaiah also cries out concerning Israel. Well, wait a minute. I thought we asked about the nations. Why are you quoting a passage concerning Israel? Concerning Israel, Michael Karras. He goes on, he says, though the number of the children of Israel be as the sand of the sea, the remnant will be saved, for he will finish the work and cut it short in righteousness, because the Lord will make a short work upon the earth. And as Isaiah said before, unless the Lord of Sabbath had left us a seed, we would have become like Sodom and been made like Gomorrah. So, folks, Paul backhands Michael Karras all the way back to the Jersey Shore, okay, because his name is The Situation. His face looks exactly like him. And so we see that Paul is calling the nations, or putting the identity marker on those of the nations that are receiving the mercy, the elect, and he's saying they are the children of Israel. They're the lost ones. They're as the sand of the sea. He quotes Hosea. If you know anything about that passage in Hosea, it's all about Ephraim, the northern tribes. Okay? This is what he's doing. He's revealing their identity. Now remember, Michael Karras would say Paul never does what we're talking about. But yet Paul just asked the question about the mercy falling on the Gentiles and quotes 3 passages that are 100% all about Israel. Lost, scattered, 10 northern tribes, Israel, folks. Catch the power. Now, how would Michael Karras deal with that in his view? Well, what he does is he appeals to something, I don't know the technical geeky term, he sure does, I'm sure, but he appeals to a repurposing of this passage. In other words, Paul, and I think Karras actually quotes a scholar because he likes to do that to as if scholars know what they're doing in the Bible anyway, right? They're all wrong. But he says that Paul wasn't actually referring to the Israelites there. He was repurposing an Old Testament text about the Israelites, but repurposing it in his day to speak of Joe Blow pagan nations, those who never knew this God, those who never were under the bondage and burden and curse of their law. This is what he says. He says it's a repurposing effect, right? You know, like those old logs in your back shed, you repurpose them. That's what Paul's doing here. He's repurposing Old Testament text. Now, Paul's probably laughing in his grave right now at that concept because notice that the second verse says Isaiah also cries out concerning Israel. So who is Paul quoting about? Who's Paul's quotes concerning? Israel. He's not repurposing anything. Nothing. He's fulfilling the magical, mystical, magic mushroom nature of the story and letting you know exactly who the saved, not all Gentiles, right? Don't put words in our mouth. Not the blanket statement nations or Gentiles. No, he's saving the elect from the nations. That's why the gospel had to go out to the nations and all the sheep would hear and come, and he would not lose one. People forget that. That's another one of those ironclad points that cuts out all arguments, is that they're looking for the elect here, right? So that just eliminates any continuationism in and of itself, or I should say, it limits it from opening up to the broad spectrum of all humanity for sure. But look at the final passage in Romans 9. Let's hammer this down and call it a night. Verse 30, what shall we say then? that Gentiles who did not pursue righteousness have attained to righteousness, even the righteousness of faith. But Israel, pursuing the law of righteousness, has not attained to the law of righteousness. Why? Because they did not seek it by faith, but as it were, by the works of the law, for they stumbled at the stumbling stone. So now, this can throw people off again, because they're forgetting what I first told you, right? They're forgetting the way that Paul and a first century Jew would use the term Israel and Jew synonymously in that day. Okay? Look what he says. He says that Gentiles or nations, the ones that are receiving mercy, these elect nations, these elect ones in the nations who did not pursue righteousness by the law, have actually attained to it. But Israel, but the Jews of that day, but modern day, or I should say present day in that time, Israel, the Jews, pursuing the law of righteousness, says Paul, have not attained to the law of righteousness. Why? Because they didn't seek it by faith, but they sought it by the works of the law. So who was seeking righteousness by the works of the law in that day, folks? It was the Jews. And notice how Paul is interchanging the two terms here. Let me demonstrate this for you. Jew and Israel. Let's go back up just 10 verses. Romans 9, verse 24. You know, he's talking about God showing his wrath, showing his mercy. He says, even us whom he called, not of the Jews only, there's the Jews, but also of the Gentiles. So here it is in Romans 9:24, Paul is comparing Jew and Gentile. Of course, he goes on, like I just said, he quotes the few passages from the Old Testament, but look what he does right here in verse 30. So actually, it's only 6 verses earlier. Paul then says, he's speaking again of the same Jew and Gentile comparison, and he says, what shall we say then, that Gentiles, there they are, who did not pursue righteousness have attained to it, but Israel, pursuing the law, has not attained to the law. So do you see how he just used Israel and Jew synonymously there? Right? You got Jew and Gentile mentioned in verse 24, and you have Israel and Gentile mentioned in verse 31. There's the synonymous usage from Paul. But these Gentiles, these nations that were receiving the mercy, these were the ones that Isaiah cried out concerning. These were the ones that Hosea predicted God would once again call them sons of the living God. These were the 10 northern tribes. This was Ephraim. And so, folks, I'm going to leave it there. I trust you understand the power of this. I trust you see what Paul was doing. Paul is very clearly not repurposing passages about Israel to speak of Joe Blow pagans, right? Where in the New Testament, or anywhere for that matter, do we have any usage or any proof that any biblical author uses that concept or that theme? Where is any other author taking the children of Israel and repurposing them and statements made about them to speak of the nations? Nowhere. Okay? This is a made-up, nonsensical, yabba-dabba-dooski, don't give it a like a Ruski theory. Okay? Nowhere does that happen. When the texts are speaking about Israel, when the texts are talking about Old Testament texts, specifically speaking about Israel, they mean Israel. Okay? They're not repurposed like an old pair of Levi jeans. Okay? They mean Israel. And much more can be said on this, but there is absolutely no chance that this argument holds any water. And it's really just a testament to how desperate and pathetic the anti-IO full continuation preterist actually is. Folks, I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, give it a like, a Ruski. If not, you know what to do, and we'll catch you on the next one. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.